align the sessions accordingly. So one of the asks from you was to learn how to migrate apps and data. So we are very excited today have James Westall from Arinco to show us how can we do that. So like I said, today is the episode 4 of season 3. So you can see the lineup of our previous and upcoming sessions. So last 3 sessions were presented by various teams from Microsoft, product and specialist teams. If you miss any of those sessions, you can always go and check our LinkedIn page for recordings. Where can you find that LinkedIn page? Well, on your screen is the QR code and the URL. So take your phones out, scan the code and subscribe. So you never miss out any recordings and updates from us. So I give you 4 more seconds. After that, we just move on, but we will be resharing this slide at the end of the session. If you're new to this session or AzureDIY, you basically have some housekeeping items. So like I said, this session is recorded and available on LinkedIn afterwards. About the question and answer, please do not hold them off. You can let the questions flow through Q&A section and our team will be answering to those questions. However, we have a dedicated 10 minutes at the end of these sessions where we take questions to James and take his opinion on those. Before I hand over the session to James, there are a few updates that I would like to share with you and on your screen. So some exciting news from the last week is that the GMS 2.0 API in the Azure Service Bus is live, which essentially means that if you are using GMS 2.0 on premises to communicate with the message broker, you can now seamlessly migrate over to the Azure Service Bus. The other great announcement is the Azure Red Hat OpenShift support for 4.6 is also GA. So if you are using or plan to use the Red Hat OpenShift, this is the update to watch out. Last but not the least, Microsoft Ignite is live at the moment, and we are entering into the last day today. We had a great announcement from the last 2 days, which we will try to cover in the next session. However, if you want to catch up on those announcements and want to follow up any specific topic or the area of interest, you can go to the official website and just watch the recording or even the live event as it happens. So that's all from my side. Don't forget to share your feedback at the end of this session. And now I would love to hand it over to the James. James?
Hey there, everyone. Just giving a second before the content goes live. So today's session, obviously, as introduced by Imran, is all on application modernization in Azure and how to move your apps and your data into the Azure platform. So for those of you who have not met me, my name is James Westall. I'm a consultant at Arinco, and Arinco is a Microsoft partner that specializes in moving people to Azure. Today's actually, as a company, our 2nd birthday, so good day to be presenting for me. In terms of today's topic, I'm going to walk you through the following agenda. Right. So for those of you who have not done any sort of application modernization on Azure before, I'm going to talk you through what that is and the various things that go into application modernization, the various scenarios where you might modernize. I'm going to talk through some of the considerations, building your strategy and the process for app modernization. I'll do a quick demonstration and talk through what Azure Migrate is and how that works, how to assess services such as things running on IIS, how to assess a SQL database compatibility. From there, we're going to move on to how to build an architecture within Azure, and that's really aligned to the Microsoft CAF and the guidance that Microsoft provides on building within Azure. We'll do a quick demonstration on moving a service to Azure. And we'll provide a GitHub link, so if you do want to go back and do that yourself, you can follow along at home and do that yourself. We're going to move a database to Azure, and then we're going to talk about operating at scale. So more often than not, organizations are going to do this more than once. So how does that look for larger companies who want to modernize using the Azure platform? And then finally, I'll provide a few resources which are great for your own research, your own self-study as you go into application modernization as a whole. So the perennial question here that obviously is, what is application modernization, right? And the answer is really, it depends, right? So every organization is going to have a different experience with application modernization. Every organization is going to have a different view based on their applications itself. But really, at its highest level, it's about changing and enhancing application architectures using the cloud so that you get the best value out of, a modern solution. If you look at the Microsoft CAF, this is actually broken up into 5 areas. So, and these are referred to as the 5 R's, and they're quite common. So you've got rehosting, which for a lot of people go, that's not really modernization, but really you're taking advantage of the cloud. So it is modernization to me. You're moving a service from A to B, right? So traditionally you would have done that in a data center, but in a cloud migration scenario, you're going to move it from, for example, your on-premise Hyper-V straight into Azure on IaaS, right? So no major changes in the application itself. It's just moving across and taking advantage of some of the cloud native capability you get when you do that. We have refactoring as a migration path as well, which is what I like to refer to as lift and shift light, right? So you have a scenario, for example, maybe you've got a website and you want to move that to Azure. You don't want to change too much of the application itself. You just want to slightly tweak it. So you move it into Azure, and rather than moving it on the IIS server that it runs on, you move it on onto something like an app service, or maybe your code itself will work in something like an Azure function and you just move it straight there. From there, you have re-architecting. And this is where you look at your application as a whole and assess out, does it work in the right way, right? Does it function correctly? Are the services too split up, etc.? So you start to move the application to the cloud and actually change it. So for example, you might move it from a monolithic application with all the functionality in a single code base out to Azure, and you break that up into services-based architecture where you're really changing how the application works. You have a rebuild option where you basically start from scratch and you can have it running in parallel and you build a brand new product that does the same thing, the same business functionality. And then the final option for those who don't want to have to maintain something going into the future is to replace it. And really what a lot of organizations do in that scenario is, rather than have, for example, a custom intranet that they're running on premise, they'll go and purchase a software as a service, something like SharePoint or Confluence or whatever they're purchasing there, to just go, look, I need this functionality. I don't want to run the application myself. I'm going to pay a service provider to do that. So those are the 5 R's, and really what makes up a lot of application modernization. When we're talking about app mod, more often than not, that's going to be wrapped into a program. And really that's around looking at, well, I've got 50 applications, or I've got 3 or 4 applications, and I need to do that over a period of time. And they're really around, those programs are really around providing efficiency to teams who are implementing application modernization. Those programs are generally going to follow a process and a procedure, right? And this is the procedure that I've seen applied at a lot of companies. It works really well, where you start out with an assessment and a strategy, right? So you start to look at your entire ecosystem or just the one app and really develop a high-level roadmap and plan for what it should look like in the future. Get an understanding of where you are so you know where you're going to be. From there, you can develop something a little bit more detailed, something like an application architecture, where it's extremely low level and says, well, this service is going to go here. I'm going to move IIS to app services. I'm going to put functions. I'm going to do AKS, whatever it is around that application architecture. You can then deliver that solution, right? So whether that's a lift and shift type migration using something like Azure Migrate, or whether that's infrastructure as code led and development focused to really dive into that modernization. And then obviously, as you wrap this into a program, you're going to start looking at rinsing and repeating. So you're looking at the solution you just deployed, understanding how it works and does it work well. Looking at things like, well, what learnings can I apply to that? Applying those back to your solution, and then feeding those back into your strategy and your planning phases, so that the next time you do that, exercise, you don't have the same kind of pitfalls. When you build a modernization strategy, more often than not, I find it's really useful for organizations to work backwards from their vision, right? So what I mean by that is, figure out where you are now, right? I'm a company, I've got 100 seats, I've got 5 applications. In a year, I want to be 200 seats. I've got a data center exit that I must complete. Work out where you're going to be in 1 year, 2 years, 6 months, whatever it is, and then work backwards from that. So look at, well, if I want to get to 200 employees, I need this application to work with 200 employees. Does it scale? Does all those sorts of things, occur? And then start to build your plan around that. Most strategies themselves, as they work backwards from that vision, are going to have a couple of things in them. So you've got a categorization of applications, right? So, some of those will be around the business category. So, finance applications go together, HR applications, custom business logic goes over here, and they're in categories aligned to, the various functions of your business. I often find it's very easy for organizations to categorize them by complexity as well. They know, most companies will know which applications they're a little bit scared of because they're big, bad, and nasty. And then the other thing that's really important is to categorize these applications into phases or modernization phases. So you look at 4 applications and say, look, that's what we're going to do first. The next 4 into those phases. Your strategy should also consider a lot of things around timelines, your budgets, your understanding of user impact. That's a big one for a lot of companies, around understanding, if I change this application, I do modernize it, what needs to happen with the users? Do I need to communicate with them? Do I need to teach them new ways of working, etc.? Understanding your skill set internally as well is really important. So obviously, if you're moving to Azure and you don't have engineers who've used the cloud before, it's really important to start obviously upskilling those teams and working that into your strategy on, well, I'm going to deploy something to functions. I need the teams to actually understand how to debug and how to use app insights, etc. It's really important, obviously, for vendor support. And that will dictate some of your planning as well. So you look at, well, I want to put an application onto app services, and I can't do that because the vendor of the application itself, who's providing a fair bit of the code, is not going to support me in those nodes. So that's an important, bit of feedback. Strategies themselves generally have either a high-level generic or a specialized plan, right? So you're looking at things like, I'm going to move each application into one of the category, and then each application goes into, I'm deploying an app services, and then here's the architecture in terms of using things like private endpoint and service plans, etc. Or they're going to have a really, specialized in the strategy. More often than not, though, in that strategy, you'll see a generic plan. Microsoft actually provides a pretty useful tool to assess kind of where you are in your building your strategy, and that's available at the link below. It asks you 17 questions, right? And those 17 questions around where you're working, have you engaged people, all of that sort of stuff, and you can get a kind of a feel for, what are the things you've missed in developing your internal strategy, what are the things you need to add, and how to actually improve your internal process. So I'd really suggest going to have a look at that. And that's available at the link that's on the screen. When you're looking in your strategy, more often than not, you're going to obviously assess each application or the application one by one, and you're going to go through that process in one of 2 ways, right? So you can do quite a bit when you talk about application modernization without getting on the tools, right? So you can look at the application, just pure business focused, maybe sit down with a BA or your technical SMEs and understand how the application works. So for example, when you're looking at your qualitative and quantitative analysis, you're looking at things like, well, my application is highly available. And then you're looking at other solutions like, well, how is it highly available? Do I have things like clustering? I have 4 nodes. What's the SLA? Understanding all of those details actually is really beneficial for a lot of companies as they start to move to the cloud. So they can look at a service and go, well, these are the qualities that I have now, and these are the qualities I must either replicate or have capability for in the future. From there, you move into things like a tools-based assessment. And tools-based assessment is obviously, using a solution to do that. And the Microsoft solution in this space is the Azure Migrate suite, which actually can be a bit of a confusing term because there's quite a few products that push data into Azure Migrate, but they have their own names. So you'll be looking at Azure Migrate for virtual machines. You're looking at stuff like the Data Migration Assistant, the Database Migration Tooling, App Service Assessment. Just this morning or yesterday morning in US time, there was a release related to containerization in migration scenarios. There's also a wide range of ISV-led tooling, and there's, I think on the Azure Migrate documentation, you're looking at about 10 to 20 different ISVs that provide tooling specific to migration and modernization scenarios. So products like Vmware, which obviously Microsoft bought, you now have to get through an engagement with Microsoft, Cloud Recon. There's a whole host of those that are specific to their little niche around, well, here's how I'm going to get to Azure. That assessment for your applications is really built on getting an understanding of how things go together so you can start to plan what they look like. And what I recommend for all of our customers is to put that into like a traffic light system, right? So just for argument's sake, you've got 10 applications you're looking at. You want to understand what are the complex applications, what are the challenging ones, and what are the simple ones. And that's really good for planning because you can look at things like, well, I've got 10 applications and 5 are simple. Right, I'm going to break that into 3 waves. And the first wave, I'm going to do 4 simple applications and 1 challenging application. And that allows the team that's doing the migration, doing the modernization work to get a feel for how Azure's working, get a feel for the process, really kind of hit their stride. You can then obviously focus on doing, well, okay, my next wave is I'm going to do, 2 challenging ones and 1 simple one, and they've learnt a lot of lessons in that initial process. Apply that there, and then the final bit there is obviously doing the final 2 or 3 complex applications. And that's really good because it allows teams to get a run up of things. And more often than not, what you'll actually find is as you start to change those simple or challenging applications, the workload for your complex applications will go down, right? So the reason those applications more often than not are complex is because you look at them and say, that's plugged into many things, right? I've got 4 databases, I've got a messaging queue, I've got all of these application dependencies. And as you start to move the other applications to Azure, the workload for the complex ones goes down. So on the topic of tools-based migration, one of the key areas for that is obviously Azure Migrate. All right, now, like I said before, Azure Migrate for a lot of people can be a bit of a confusing term, but it's a broad ecosystem, right? So you've got support in the platform for IaaS virtual machines and VDI. Right now, I think as of Ignite, it's coming out of preview. You've also got support for Azure VMware solutions, and that will look at things like if you're doing a lift and shift migration, is the operating system supported? What's the recommended sizing? What bandwidth am I going to need to copy things to Azure? The announcements this morning included deeper support for Microsoft SQL and databases running on servers. It'll provide both that assessment capability and the movement capability. You've got .NET and Java specific assessments for web applications, so you can actually assess a .NET application and move it to Azure. You can assess a Java application, do the same thing. One of the things I really like, especially with the agentless Azure Migrate assessment, is the insight for service dependencies. So this is actually built off the Azure Service Map feature, which is supported in a large number of regions. And it provides a really good tools-based way to work out what's talking to what. More often than not, you're going to have an architecture diagram that says, well, my web tier is talking to my backend, but you have that a tools-based approach that might pick up something else. So you already know your web tier is talking to your backend, but perhaps you've got some other API or some other solution that's actually being called, and that approach will pick up that. So I really recommend using either the agentless dependency mapping or service map to get that data out. And you can see in the bottom right, that screenshot there is actually taken out of the live service map, which shows all the interdependencies between the various servers. For data specifically, you've got the DMA, so Database Migration Assistant. and their DMS, the Database Migration Service, which obviously can assess and migrate your services. And that's really powerful as well. It'll provide compatibility level for SQL, it'll provide column level recommendations, and it'll do the migration for you. So the whole suite as a whole, without going out to purchase an extra ISV tool, is really, really powerful. So what I think would be really good to do right now would be to go through just a really quick demonstration of App Service Assessment and Data Migration Assistant and what it looks like to actually assess each application. So for the context of this demonstration, what I have is I have two resource groups, which are going to simulate our on-premise environment. So I've got a target resource group, which has nothing in it, and I've got a demonstration resource group. So this demonstration resource group has a bunch of stuff in it, but for the purpose of this demo, the stuff that's really important is we've got a web virtual machine and a SQL Server virtual machine. So I can log into those VMs and then install the various tooling. I've already done that in advance. But one of the things I want to touch on before I even get there is I can work out if some of the tooling is going to work for me straight away. So here I've got a public IP address of my web VM. I haven't configured any sort of DNS. And I can come and look at the Microsoft website for App Service Assistant, which is what we're going to use, and click Assess. And this is really good because I can immediately tell, once this loads, if the assessment is even actually going to work for me, if it's, if it's even going to be viable. Now, I've actually assessed here a demonstration app that I already migrated, and that was a .NET 1 app, and it's come up as not supported using the tool. But the app we're going to migrate today is a .NET 2 app. Doesn't want to play nice, that's okay. That is supported and does work. So it's quite useful here in clicking Assess, you'll get a bit of extra information. So for example, I could type in docs.microsoft.com, assess, all right, the tool's obviously demonstrations going not working, but it pulls out a bunch of extra information and will tell you if you are supported to use the tool. I know my applications are supported, so I'm going to switch across to that. So I'm on my web server here, and this is just a plain IIS web service, right? So if I go to my site, there's nothing too fancy about this. I'm just using a Microsoft Parts Unlimited demonstration. I'll use the new Edge, thank you very much. And it's a very standard application that, is just obviously letting me sell things online. So to start that assessment process, I'm going to have installed the App Service Migration Assistant, which I already have done. I'm going to start that up, and it's going to do some basic checks, right? It'll actually check what's installed on the server. I can do remote servers as well, but for this one, I'm going to do obviously the default site. I click Next. I haven't logged into Azure. I haven't done anything fancy there. And I've immediately come back with a success for the default site, right? And that's 13 checks. If I had an issue, say for example, I turned on Windows authentication, which obviously app services don't immediately support because they're not connected to an Active Directory domain, I would get a warning or an error here. There's a lot of detail available if you go and have a look at the App Service Migration Assistant GitHub, where you can actually see, well, these are all the checks that are occurred, but why is it failed? Right? So I can look at things like location tags, ISAPI filters inside of IIS, all that sort of wonderful information, which is really useful. I click Next here, and I can log into Azure and actually upload that data. Now, before I do that, actually, that's fine. Copy code. Paste that in. Okay, so there's my login. And what I do in that scenario is I select an Azure Migrate project. I've already got one created that I can use. I click Next, and that data is going to upload to Azure. From here, I move on to a migration scenario where I'm actually pushing this website across to Azure, which I don't want to do just yet. So I'm going to leave this one for now. The same process actually exists for SQL servers. Okay, so again, I'm on an older 2008 server here, and I've installed the Data Migration Assistant, and I've started a new assessment of SQL. So I can come in here and have a look at this and go, okay, well, I want a new assessment. I'm going to call it my assessment. I'm going to, assess the database or integration services. Obviously, in this scenario, I want database. My source is SQL Server, and then I also want to know what I'm targeting, right? So really what you're looking at in a lot of scenarios is whether you're moving to the Azure SQL database or managed instance. As a general rule of thumb, I would say that most SQL instances are going to support managed instances, and you'll probably have a little bit more in the checks of Azure SQL. But I'm going to click Create here. It's going to assess the database for compatibility and feature parity. I'm going to click Next, and I have some details around authenticating to SQL. So my user here is public website or Parts Unlimited website. I'm using SQL Server authentication, and I've just made sure to trust the certificates because I'm not using any sort of CA certificates in this environment. All I'm doing here is clicking Apply and then Start Assessment. And then this will do some thinking around, well, how is SQL configured? And you can pretty quickly see, well, on the feature parity, I'm going to be okay. I've got a couple of recommended features, but I don't need to stress about these because I'm not using SSRS and I'm not using analysis services, so I don't worry about those. If I look at the compatibility, it's giving me the compatibility issues, if there were any, for various versions of SQL. So obviously those numbers align to the various versions of SQL and where the feature parity is. Same scenario as before, I can actually upload that to Azure and then push that into the Azure Migrate project. I'm not going to do that now, but what you can see is if you come back and have a look at your Azure Migrate project, right, you can see the apps that you've assessed as you've uploaded them. So I've got a different project. I'm using the production migrate project. And click OK. I'll see here, this is for another app, but I've discovered one web server. I've assessed one website, and it will tell me straight away if the website is ready for migration. Right? So if I had 10, 15, 20 servers, it'll tell me at a glance, 10 of these are good to go, 5 are going to need a little bit of love before they proceed. So you can see here I've got the music store and the default website, and both of those have passed the 13 checks that we talked about before. So at a high level, that's our assessment. Right? It's really straightforward, and most companies can do single lift and shift or slight refactoring assessments in an afternoon if they've got enough access and time and willingness. Once you've completed an assessment, you then move on to developing an Azure architecture. And Microsoft provides so much information on this process. There's just phenomenal amounts of information. I'd highly suggest for anyone looking at a modernization process to go and sit through and read the CAF and read the architecture guidance. It is a bit of a read because there's a lot of it, but it's really informative in terms of how you're going to change the application going forward. With regards to architecture, for a lot of customers, I will see a focus on software as a service, functions over services, and PaaS as a service because they provide a really high return on investment. As someone with an infrastructure background, that sort of stuff to me is fabulous because if I go to platform as a service, I have less things to maintain. You're really looking at making sure you align to well-architected framework principles. So you're looking at obviously making sure your solutions run in a cost-optimized manner, not getting a lovely bill shock at the end of the month, making sure your solutions are secure, they're performing well. So obviously working back off those metrics you've collected in your early assessment phases. Operational excellence is around obviously actually making sure you have automated processes for the day-to-day work, right? So obviously with a lot of DevOps and SRE focus in today's ecosystem, you have a focus on reducing toil, that kind of grindy work that you have to do all the time. And then obviously you've got a reliability framework principle, which is obviously around, well, if your service isn't there, it's not very good. One thing that's not covered in this slide, but is sometimes covered depending on your environment, is a principle around hybrid and what your solution looks like as it operates between your legacy on-premise data center and the Azure cloud. So you start out with your architecture style and move on from there. So in the context of application modernization, more often than not, you're going to see one of the 4 following styles. So you're going to see something that a lot of people are familiar with, right? You're going to see that N-tier architecture where you've got your web tier, your application logic tier, and your database tier, right? That's something a lot of people are comfortable with. It's not going anywhere anytime soon, and it's actually really easy, really good to implement, especially in sort of lift and shift migration scenarios or slight refactoring. From there, you've got an event-driven architecture, and that's really useful in terms of things like IoT or anything that's real-time. You see a lot of pub sub based architectures here, Azure Functions, event hubs, etc. Web queue worker, and for a lot of people, they'll go, oh, this is just N-tier architecture. And this is really useful where you have an application that is maybe not so responsive now. And the reason it's not responsive is because you've got long running processes. So you can start to move your application to a web queue worker architecture around building a queue and having the success feedback to the user so they get that immediate prompt, and then have the worker go and handle that long running process in the background. And then the final thing that you see more often than not with a modernization process is a microservices architecture. And this is really, really powerful when you have a large monolithic application with a lot of dependencies and you want to start to break that up. But in practice, you really need to have the right organizational structure to do microservices. You need to have those smaller teams who can actually monitor those services and build them out and develop them as as an architecture. For a lot of people, often that can be the thing they go, I want to go to, but when they actually sit down and do that assessment and planning, they'll find that maybe I don't need to go to that depth, to that level. When you have decided on your kind of high-level architecture and abstracted, this is what my solution is going to look like, you then get into the scenario of picking services. So for any architecture, you're going to have to pick, generally speaking, at a minimum 4 things. You're going to have to pick your compute layer, as in what's actually going to run my application, your data layer, which is obviously what's going to store my information, the load balancing, which is really focused on making sure that the service can scale and the data is going in the right location as it scales. And then the messaging, which is all around obviously how your services are communicating to each other, where the data is flowing as it moves through the service. The Microsoft CAF provides some really, really good input on what you should pick in various scenarios. So the diagram that I've got here on the right is for compute. And it asks you just basic questions around, well, how are you migrating? Are you building something new? Are you doing lift and shift? And then understanding around, well, can it run in a container? Does it need orchestration? All of those sorts of things. And it points you out to a various service that is probably best suited for what you need based on the those small questions. There's obviously a little bit extra that will feed into this, but generally kind of try to nudge you in the right direction. With this specific example, what I want to point out is that you'll notice that even though a lot of people are pushing into something like Kubernetes or microservices, those solutions in this diagram are not the first thing off the rank, right? More often than not, you're seeing people modernize using services like app services, using virtual machines, or using functions, using those other services that don't come with a higher burden of learning and a higher burden of knowledge. I think just in this diagram, you've got 4 instances of 3 or 4 instances of app services out of, I don't know, 12 options. So you can see that they're starting to move into those PaaS functions. There's also examples specific to .NET applications, and that's all in the application architecture stuff. So you can see here, obviously, you've got app server has custom dependencies, and if it doesn't have custom dependencies, it's going straight to app services. You could put it in a container, but that doesn't mean it's the best option for you. So there's a bit of planning to go into that process. Once you've planned out your architecture and understand exactly how an application is going to go together, you then come to an implementation approach, where you've got your fancy new architecture, like the two on the right, which are for end-tier architectures with the web front end. You have to implement that service, right? So Azure Migrate will do a lot of the heavy lifting for you, which is really good, especially in lift and shift or slight refactoring scenarios. But there's some things that really help a lot of organizations as they start to accelerate. So for example, DevOps first, for a lot of, especially for infrastructure people who've never worked in the cloud, can be quite challenging or quite new to them. But going through that approach of saying, well, here's my declared resources, here's how I'm deploying them using Azure DevOps, can be really beneficial, because that thing you just did for application 1 becomes repeatable for application 2, which is really, really powerful. Infrastructure as code in this place, in this kind of scenario, is your friend, right? Because it allows someone to say, here's what I got working. Maybe I'm going to export the template. I'm going to write the template myself. Maybe I want to write Terraform, PowerShell, whatever it is, to say, here's how I got it working, and it's going to run out of the sandbox in the production environment. One thing I do recommend to all of my customers is to enable cloud solutions early. So once you move a solution, you then have to obviously take advantage of the cloud native capability within that solution. So for example, you're moving an app service, but that doesn't automatically enable monitoring of said app service. So you can go and then turn on something like Application Insights, which is going to give you greater visibility into how the application is actually performing. Same thing for Security Center. It's going to give you that point in time. These are the things that needs to be improved in the security posture. And the final thing I want to touch on when I talk about implementation is that a piecemeal approach is just fine. And what I mean by that is, a lot of organizations and teams will lock themselves into saying, well, I need to build all of this in one go. Right? So they'll sit down and go, here's my application, I'm going to modernize it, I'm going to deploy the website, the backend, I'm going to deploy all of the stuff that goes into this solution to the cloud, I'm going to enable all of these features, and I'm going to do it in one go. And that could be a trap for a lot of people and a lot of organizations, because they adopt all of this new in their environment, and then they have an issue and they get spread thin. So taking a solution apart one by one, and especially if you're working in a hybrid scenario, and implementing new functionality is just fine. So what I'll touch on in a second is you can see the migration of the app service occur, and I have the option to leave the database on-prem and connect it up that way. That's just fine if that's going to work. Obviously understand your metrics and work off that, but don't feel pressured to just push the application into the cloud just because. So what I want to demo now is deploying to Azure App Services using the Migration Assistant. And I also want to demonstrate migrating the SQL backend. So I'm going to flick back across to our virtual machines from earlier. And I'm going to proceed with the migration from what we assessed before. So I have an option here to just lift and shift migrate the application that's running on my local host. So this application straight into the cloud. So to do that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to click here. I'm going to say, I'm going to use an existing resource. I'm going to use the target resource group. I'm going to call this AzureDIY resource, if that's good. Yep. Okay, so that's an allowed name. I'm going to create a new app service plan, and because I'm in Australia, I'm going to fill up the Sydney data center. And you can see here, I've got an option to skip the database setup entirely, or if I'm going in that piecemeal approach and I want to set up hybrid connectivity, I can click enable here, provide the SQL database name, and continue onwards. That's really useful for obviously moving and keeping the database where it is. Maybe you've got other applications that depend on it. And what this actually does is it automatically configures Azure Relay and relays all of the database connections that would otherwise be occurring in the cloud from service to service back on premise and to that on-premise database. So I'm going to skip that for now. You'll note here I can export an ARM template out and use that in, for example, a DevOps flow to provision these resources. I'm not going to do that here. I'm just going to click migrate. And that will pretty much immediately flick over to a migration scenario where you look at each, where it basically pushes through the migration. So what I can look at is I can come into my Azure portal. I'll just, oh, that's way too much. I'll do it on this one. I can come into the Azure portal. I can look at my target resource group, and eventually I can see the ARM template that's being deployed, and I can see the resources slowly deploy into that resource group. So here's my app service plan that just got deployed, and that will eventually migrate my application. So we'll come back to that one in a bit. Again, this is just going to monitor that through to completion for us. I can also do a similar process with SQL. And in this process, what I'm going to do is I'm going to do it in a two-step scenario. So I'm going to use the data migration assistant to move my schema to Azure. So how the table is set up. So I'm going to call this my migration. I'm going to use the source of SQL. My target is Azure SQL DB. And I only want to move the schema. I can do schema in data, but I want to just do the schema so I can use DMS afterwards. I'm going to do, that should work, localhost. Use SQL Server authentication. My user in this scenario is Parts Unlimited web user. Welcome 123, but world's most secure password. And click continue. No, it doesn't like that. Just have to. Just have to pull up the SQL hostname. Okay. Okay, helps if I use the right username. That's wonderful. Okay, I'm going to leave this one for now because I can't seem to log in. I must have typed the wrong password when I set this up, but that's okay. But what I would do in this scenario is I would log in here, I would select the database in question, I would select the objects in the database, so the actual schema tables, and then I would script that, and then the DMA would automatically script that out, and I have a button here that says migrate to Azure. And what that will do is actually apply that schema to a selected database within Azure. So I have that database already set up. So I need to set that up in advance, but I've got here a parts database, right, which currently has a blank schema. From there, I've got a database with a schema in it, and I can go into the Azure DMS or the database migration service, and I can create a migration project. I can provide in a name, whatever that needs to be. I can select the target of on-premise, whatever that is. And again, depending on what my source database is, I can move that to Azure using that. And then I can target out while I'm moving to, a managed instance, I'm moving to the SQL PAS. From here, I have the option to do the data migration or the schema only migration. So what the ideal would be is to do the data migration, having already done the schema and not getting the wrong password. And I would come through this wizard, I would provide in things like the details of the original, server, let's go with this. No, I think I'm doing the wrong password still. So I would provide in the details of the user, That'll allow me to select the database. From there, I select the Azure target database and move it across that way. And then finally, I map the data from the tables that were created on premise to that schema that's been created in my DMS, and that will move everything for me. It'll do all of the work for me. So that's the kind of the high level process, at least for the SQL Server, but I can come back and check on that app service migration that I kicked off before. And that's already completed, right? So I can click go to your website here, and you'll notice that it immediately flicks me out to an Azure App Service plan, and that will load up on my service. So I can come back here, and in my target resource group, I can have a look and I can see the app service itself deployed, running here, and that's moved automatically. I can come in and have a look at things like Kudu and see the files that were copied across. Just wait for the simple sign-on to kick in. Why not? Okay. So I can see the files that were copied in my site. I can see them directly copied from IIS on-premise into the service, and I should be able to come back here, and here's my website now running in Azure. And I didn't have to do too much to move that. The SQL process is very similar, provided you obviously remember your password. Once I've done that, then I can start to do that whole enablement process where I look at turning on things like application insights, right? Where I've got an application and I don't even have the code in this now. I've just got the compiled files on my server. I can come in here and turn on app insights, enable the required resources. I've got this one already set up, turn that on, and start to take advantage of some of those modern monitoring tools without too much change to my application. So moving on from that, you end up with a scenario where you've got tools such as Azure Migrate, App Service Assessment, the DMA and the DMS to move to Azure. You then have to start wrapping that up. One of the easiest ways I've found at a lot of organizations to wrap that up into a desired plan is building what we refer to with a lot of our customers as a modernization factory. And that's really driven from a center of excellence way of thinking around the cloud. So obviously as you adopt the cloud, you start to have teams that become better at it, right? So building a modernization factory, you select, 3, 4, 5, whatever it is to the scale of your organization, people who are really responsible for modernizing within Azure and moving up to the cloud. And they focus on both engaging with your application teams and your SMEs and really helping them along in that cloud adoption journey. So to do that, you have to have a decent understanding of where you are and your skill set in terms of your cloud adoption. You have to have standard patterns, right? So for example, when we were talking before around the various architecture patterns, you would say for event-driven, I'm always going to have a event grid tied to Azure Functions, right? That's kind of the pattern that I have, and have that pattern, apply that using the Modernization Factory, and then start to get your app teams to consume those standardized patterns. The factory is really good as well in terms of providing your application groups with escalation and advisory capability. So as people move to Azure, they're going to have challenges around, well, what does that look like for me? Or I don't know how to do this. So you can provide a dedicated point where someone can go and say, hey, I've got app services. How do I work with the scaling? How do I, do SSL? All of those sorts of questions that just come up through learning. You provide the resources as well to teach them, but also you provide someone who can act as that kind of coach and mentor. And to me, the most important thing around building a modernization factory is it ensures that legacy doesn't get left behind. So what I mean by that is more often you'll find in a modernization process that you've got 20 applications. 10 of them are really cared about in terms of the business. They go, that's critical to me. They've got support. They've got all of that information that's needed. You'll have the other 8 that are equally as important and well known. And then you'll have 2 that, will be in the quote unquote graveyard in the area of your business that no one knows about it. Maybe it sits on a computer under your desk, but you actually need that service for whatever reason. Maybe it's compliance or perform some little critical business function that not many people understand, but you need it. All right. So building a modernization factory is really useful because while your app teams are migrating all of the critical stuff, you can actually get this team to say, well, hey, I need someone to go look at that thing, right? That one application that's 20 years old, and do we need to move it? How do we do it? Understand that, and because they're specialists in doing that, modernization approach, they'll be better suited to actually look after that legacy that would normally get left behind, just left behind. So with that, I think I'll pass off to some resources. So I've touched on these before, but I think it's really important that anyone who's moving to Azure has a really good read of the Cloud Adoption Framework and understands the process involved in that. Specifically, it's good to understand the 5 R's of rationalization. So I talked through at the start, but obviously go back and visit those. Microsoft provides data migration and app migration websites, which actually provide a lot of insight specifically to each tool. So if you want to look at the DMA, go to datamigration.microsoft.com. If you want to look at the app service, same thing. There's a lot of really good information on the .NET architecture that you can deploy and the considerations when doing .NET specific modernization. And then one of the things I like to look at as well is the AKS Innovate framework that's inside the Cloud Adoption Framework. And the reason for that is not so much that it's specific to Kubernetes, it's more around the process and the procedure that's wrapped around that innovation that I think is really quite beneficial for reading. One thing I would touch on though is the what's new in Azure Migrate. So this came out, the session in Australian time was 9:30 this morning, so it's about 4 hours old now. Scan this QR code, there's a 15-minute Microsoft Mechanics session on all of the new things that are in Azure Migrate and all of the extra data you can get. It's really consumable because obviously in video format, you don't have to think too much. Highly recommend watching that. And with that, hit me with the questions, I'm ready for them.
Awesome. Thank you very much, James. That was really exciting session. And yes, we got a few questions. And before we get into the questions, I think not only myself, but some of the people also, like our audience, love your slide deck. So would that be okay for you to share this deck? I'm
quite happy to share that, yep.
That's awesome. So I think that answered the question. Now, let's get into some of those questions. And the first question is, when we are doing actual assessment, how can I get the picture of applications across all my environments? Will Azure Migrate help?
Yeah, so in that scenario, if you're looking at, for example, let's just say you've got a virtualized data center, so you've got 30 servers. A really good way to do that is obviously to plug in Azure Migrate and then start to use the application dependency mapping and application assessment within the Azure Migrate assessment. That doesn't mean you have to go and assess each server to do a lift and shift migration, but it can give you a really good insight in terms of what's installed where, right? So you look at, well, I've got, these functions, Windows Server functions installed on each server. I've got things like monitoring, you can pick up that sort of stuff. And if you've got, say, for example, a third-party service, say, for example, something like Tableau that you want to move to Power BI, you can actually pick that that's installed on a server, right? So you can start to get an understanding of, well, here's the applications I have installed. And then to make sure that that's sane and not, really difficult to actually assess, you kind of feed that back into what you have in business knowledge around sitting down with each team and saying, well, what do you use? And also, looking at things like an IT CMDB and all that sort of information around getting that data.
That's awesome. Thank you very much, James. Another question, and I think that's more of your opinion about something, and that is, what things or feature creep do you see make migrations take longer than expected? For example, is it disaster recovery, DevOps, or infrastructure as a code?
The thing that's always going to take it's always going to expand your migration time and really, I suppose, waste business output is not having adequate planning. So with a lot of companies, what we'll see is they'll go, I just want to move to Azure, And that's great, like that's a really good desire to obviously have, but they'll just go in the portal and click next, 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 I want a virtual machine, and it'll put it, for example, in the case of virtual machines, if you just click next through the GUI, you'll end up with a virtual machine by itself. It won't have disk encryption on, or it won't have customer managed encryption. It will be in its own VNet. You know, it'll be missing a bunch of configuration and things that you would normally apply in a scalable and enterprise framework. So I think that's probably the biggest thing in terms of, well, I really want to get here now and I don't do enough planning around it. So what would be a bit more scalable is obviously to sit down and build out, for example, your landing zones and your shared services infrastructure. So you've got that kind of foundational element you can build on top of. And the reason that obviously, if you don't do that, you obviously end up with a feature creep is because you move so quickly to get to the cloud, you then have to come back and refit everything you did, which you're effectively just creating more work for yourself. So to me, that would be the reason why we see, you know, the longer timeframes in migration is just not adequate understanding of the planning and the pre-steps that need to occur.
That makes perfect sense. Yes, you're right. I think planning is the key here, which is the key ingredient when you're, you know, going for the migration. And I'm just conscious of time. I think we can take one more question before we can move on to the feedback slides. So a question for you: for a large application spanning over dozens of servers and have complex feature set, should we be looking at the gradual migration or migrate it all at once and just cut over? It's more like a pros and cons, and what should we look out if we are assessing that sort of an application?
There's a couple things to look at that. So if you're doing, for example, a big bang migration, that can be really, really good if you've got the capability to go back and forth, right? So before Azure Migrate was obviously all the rage to move applications, you saw a lot of people moving with services like ASR, where they could fail a service up to Azure and then decide if they didn't like it and fail it back. So I think for big bang migrations, it's really around obviously understanding your business risk and your business appetite, because obviously you've got a process in terms of, well, maybe I can't have an outage. Right? So in that scenario, you're looking at things like, well, how is the data centers that we've got the service running structured? How do we move the application in a way that doesn't result in a user outage? You've also got to consider a lot of things like, especially with large applications, like your data churn and your data rate of change. So looking at things like, maybe I'm handling so much information that I can't copy the data in the right speed, or how do I process enough, how do I synchronize the data between on-premise and the cloud? So we end up in a hybrid model. And I think that's, for a lot of companies, is an easier way to do it, where, for example, you've got a huge rate of change on SQL, you can establish a SQL service in Azure and then sync the data. And you don't have to worry too much around, well, I can't keep up with my rate of change because the application itself writes data to both locations and it's not a write and copy. The I suppose political answer to that question is it really depends. For a lot of companies, it's just around obviously understanding what their business rationale is and what their kind of willingness is to change within the application.
That makes sense, James, and thank you very much. I think I'm just conscious of the time. You're almost at the end. So let's move on to the next slide, if you would, please.
Yeah.
So thank you very much, everyone. Please share your feedback. I'm giving you like 30 seconds to please scan the QR code and give us your feedback, because it's really important to us. And we want to also hear that what else you want to put together for you. So, for example, this session was one of the examples where we had a feedback that you wanted to see migration. So we aligned this session. So please keep your feedback coming. Last slide, please, James. So this is our LinkedIn page. So the recording will be available, and any updates that we make will be available on this page. So please feel free to go on to this AzureDIY LinkedIn page and subscribe to our channel so you never miss any updates or news from us. So I would like to thank you very much, James, for your time today, for a wonderful session. And I would also like to thank everyone who joined us today. So we will see you next week. Thank you very much.